So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you're having a good day. We will start in just about 4 minutes, so you've got a few minutes to get started. And here's the webinar slide. So hopefully you see the title. If not, drop a note in the questions, and we'll deal with it and see what's going on. So what's going on in the world? So we changed, in case some of you know, I think a lot of you are Redgate customers, but we recently rebranded one of our DevOps tools to SQL Change Automation. Happened last week, and we broadcast our SQL in the City June edition last week as well. So up on the Redgate YouTube site, the videos area, we've got a session from last week that talks about kind of the change and what that means. The bottom line is everything kind of continues to still work, but we're slowly using DevOps to merge our tools together as well and give you a better experience. So we may talk a little bit about that today, but we'll see how it goes. Other than that, I just got back from a week in Cork, so I'm still, I don't know, my time zone is still somewhere over the Atlantic right now. I've been up for far too many hours. Arnie, it's been 11 days or 12 days over in the UK, so
yeah, exactly.
it's gonna be a
Yeah,
rough few days.
yeah.
So it's quite warm over there.
I know. Yeah, that's what I heard. You did a couple of sessions for SQL in the City as well while you were there.
I did one. On
Okay.
Protecting your dev and test environments. Really, kind of talking about data masking and things you should do to limit your surface attack area in those environments, since certainly
Right.
a lot of our customers around the world are affected by GDPR or similar legislation. So I did a talk there, and then I did a kind of a compliance-based talk, which is similar to the one I did a few weeks ago at the Pass Marathon over in Ireland, the ISACA group, which is the Information Security and Auditing organization. They actually invited me over there to talk to their Western Ireland chapter. So that was interesting. It's a whole different view for those people because they're worried about compliance and auditing and security rather than getting stuff done. So
yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So it was interesting for sure. So how about you? Things going well out there in California?
Yeah, going really well. Obviously the weather is warm as always, so which helps.
It's beautiful. It's funny,
Exactly,
I've been to LA twice this month. Like I flew out for SQL Saturday a few weeks ago, spent a week in LA, and then, or a couple days, and then I flew actually to LA to fly to London. That was the most convenient flight for me, and I think that's my favorite flight now because the United Terminal LAX is compact, so it's easy to change planes.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly.
So I may stick with LAX as my go-to spot from now on. So, all right, let's top of the hour. Are you ready to go, Arnie? Ready to kick this off?
Yeah, let's do this.
All right, we've got a lot of people signed in, so let's get going. And I think we're going. All right. Well, welcome everybody to our new webinar from Redgate Software. This is extending DevOps to the database and focusing on continuous integration today. Today we're going to follow kind of a similar format that we've done a number of times, in that we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of what we want to do, and then spend hopefully most of our time in a demo. So my name is Steve Jones, and I'm kind of hosting or emceeing the webinar today. My contact information is on the screen, but I work for Redgate Software as an evangelist, and I've been at Redgate now for 10 years, both writing and talking about SQL Server and about Redgate tools. So I travel all around the world doing sessions at different events, as well as doing these remote type events like here. And then I run SQL Server Central. That's what is really my primary job. So I focus on a regular basis of trying to put information out there that helps you become better at your job or answering questions at the site. So if you want to get a hold of me or connect with me, please feel free, because all my contact information is there. And with me today to do the webinar, I have one of our amazing sales engineers, Arneh Eskandari. So Arnie, let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Steve. So, hey everyone, my name is Arneh Eskandari. I'm the head of sales engineering for the North America region here at Redgate, and As part of my role, I've worked with a lot of clients in different industries, finance, healthcare, technology, mostly on the DevOps side of things. So, from doing health checks as far as preliminary looking at the current processes for organizations around their DevOps processes for databases, or just a general change management processes for databases, and making recommendations on best practices and things that the organizations would need to change to include their databases as part of their DevOps processes. So if you have any questions after the webinar today, or if you need anything, feel free to reach out.
All right, thanks a lot, Arnie. So here's our quick agenda. Really the first 5 items, I'm just going to spend a few minutes chatting about those, just kind of level setting across just the next 5 or 10 minutes. And then we want to spend most of the time in a demo because, it's a lot of stuff that we do, and I think it's really impressive, and it helps to kind of inspire you for understanding how database DevOps might help you. Now, a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, and so we'll make the recording available probably in about 2 or 3 days. It'll get up onto the Redgate video site on YouTube, and we'll also send everybody an email that registered. We will take questions during the session, so there's a questions panel in your control panel, or a pane, a little area. You can go ahead and send a question in there, and either I'll try to answer it by typing the answer, or if we have time or we can fit it in, I'll get Arnie to answer it as well, so everybody can see those. But you should be able to get the Q&A as well later on this week. So with that, let's dive in a little further. So let me start with just Redgate, because we're sponsoring this webinar. It's a great company. It's one of the best companies I've worked for in my career, and we're primarily based in the UK in Cambridge, but we have a couple of offices in the US, and Arnie is actually in our California office. We're a little over 200 people, and we've spent almost 20 years now building software that helps you build software. So our goal is really to build these ingeniously simple tools that help you build database software, or .NET software, or cloud software, or something else. We have some Oracle and MySQL and a few other tools, but we are primarily focused in the SQL Server market. We've got lots of customers around the world from all different kinds of organizations, but there's a couple of things I want to point out here. So in the bottom row, and the third item over, is the number of product releases we had last year. We have about 30-ish products, I think, in total. And across those 30 products, we had 1,100 releases last year. If you are a customer of ours, if you are checking for updates or tracking, you'll notice that we release probably almost every product at least every 2 weeks. Some release every week. Some may go a little bit longer, but we work in a DevOps process ourselves, where we try to respond to customer feedback, to bug reports, to support issues, to enhancements, and we try to put those out there on a regular basis. I can tell you, in our release Slack channel, when I watch it, we've got releases going on 3 or 4 days a week. We release 1 or 2 products every day, and so we're trying to constantly evolve. And so we see the benefit of that as a company, and we're trying to help you do that as well in the database world. Now, the last 2 items on the right-hand side actually are things I'm really proud of from Redgate, that we really support the community. So we want to sell you software. We'd love to sell you software, but in addition to that, we want to help you become better at using our software or building your own software, even if you don't use our tools. We support SQL Server Central and Simple Talk, where we host the sites and we pay authors to write articles and we answer questions. And we sponsor lots of user groups, SQL Saturdays and other conferences, because we believe in being part of the community. So it's not just that we want to sell you software, but we want to be a part of the community and help you in other ways if that's possible. Now, when we talk about DevOps, it's become this rather popular term in the last 4 or 5 years, but it's nothing really that I've been doing for almost 20 years in software development. And it's really about building better software using kind of best practices in a lightweight manner. Now, a lot of people have moved to a DevOps process, but they leave the database behind, and that's always a challenge, because we have data that's important, and because the state of that data has to be maintained. So as we update or change or evolve our database, whether that's tables or objects or views, we have to maintain that state as part of the process, which makes doing DevOps for the database much more challenging than doing other software like C# or Python or .NET or Java or something else. Now, if you're not doing a DevOps process, and believe me, you don't have to use the Redgate tools to do a DevOps process, but just following the idea of DevOps, which is the way that I've worked in the past and lots of companies have worked, what we find is that the database is often a bottleneck. When I study and talk with people that do DevOps on the application software side of things, they often kind of leave the DevOps or the database side out of it. They really focus on their Java software or their C# software or something else. And as a result, the database sometimes becomes a bottleneck. It slows down the application development, which is a hassle, and it creates tension and it creates problems. But the other thing is, because we are evolving state, we have to have the ability to understand what changes are taking place so that we can A, understand the impact, but B, also be able to roll back if that's a problem. And because most of us do manual work to build these scripts to evolve our database or to deploy new changes, what ends up is that we don't often have an easy way to roll back. We don't often have any traceability of what's going on, which is becoming more and more important as the security becomes an issue in the world, especially with data. The other problem is that we get nervous about data releases. We get stressed, we become concerned, not just technical people, but also business people. And so we tend to pile up changes and make releases less often, which inherently makes them more risky. We're not practicing, we don't know that the process or that the steps we follow are going to be 100% correct. And so these become problems. And then, of course, if we're doing this stuff manually, if we're trying to put it together and doing this regularly, we actually end up eating a lot of time from our skilled labor, whether that's the DBA or the developer. We're using up a lot of their hours. The goal when we do a database DevOps process is that I want a repeatable, reliable process that I can count on. I want to know exactly how it's going to occur, and I want to be sure that my change will be deployed to the correct environment in a way that I can count on. And so we try to eliminate all the manual steps, all the manual dependencies we have on particular people, and we try to ensure that we have an automated way of deploying those changes. Once we do that, we can make these changes more often because we have confidence in them. We don't wait till late Friday night once a quarter or early Sunday morning, which are times I've had to release software before. Instead, we can start to release smaller units of change because we have confidence they'll go through, and so we can make a change that we need for our application software and then make another change later. We don't have to bundle those all together, which also helps us to align better with the application software. And because we're doing this in an automated fashion, we have predictable steps, it becomes easier for us to raise the quality of our software by building in testing. I'm a huge fan of testing. I'm a huge advocate. And I think having automated test stages, multiple stages that allow me to double check our work and prevent regressions is a huge part of increasing the quality of our changes. The Redgate software started doing a state of database DevOps report. Puppet Labs does their own state of DevOps report. And over the last years, we found some interesting things as we've surveyed not only our customers, but also various other customers in the world that are just doing DevOps development or not doing DevOps development. We've hired some survey companies to do this. We find that the vast majority of companies that build software are planning to adopt DevOps. And this could be companies that build software to sell, like Redgate does, or it could be corporations that build their own internal software. In either case, people are finding that they want to increase the speed of delivery for both their application and their databases, and so they're moving to DevOps. And this isn't for just people that have a DBA that wants to do it. We find that the vast majority of people we've surveyed have people that work across the entire stack. So they work on both the application and the database side. So they definitely want to move forward in a way that makes their job easier and it makes it smoother to deliver those changes. The full report is in this slide, so when you download it, if you'd like to, you can get that. The Puppet Lab State of DevOps report from last year found a number of things that have been the same for many years. I've been following this report for probably 4 or 5 years, and they constantly find that almost the number one predictor of can you deliver software in a better fashion is that you use version control and continuous integration or continuous delivery processes to ensure that you follow the same steps every time you push your software out there. And so the organizations that do that have much higher performing IT groups. The business is happier, they cost less, they're more efficient. The other thing they found, and to me, it's not that we deploy more software, though certainly we find that these high performing IT organizations do deploy more software, they make more deployments. It's that they have less failures in deployment. And more importantly, when there is an issue, because we're going to have issues at times, they recover so much faster than organizations that aren't doing this. They understand exactly what's being changed. They have instrumentation and metrics that tell them where changes have occurred and specifically what's happened, and they have the ability to recover very quickly. And all of this adds up to more profitable, more efficient, more market share for any company, and certainly better productivity. So for Redgate, we want to help you. And again, we focus primarily in the database world. So when I look at this diagram, what we see is on the left, we have developers that are working, and on the right, we have our production systems. And so the flow is left to right, even though in the real world, it's kind of in a circle, right? We deploy changes, and right away, we're making new changes. But over on the left-hand side, our developers, tend to work on databases and they build their software. And we prefer a sandbox for every developer. And that's what we try to preach because we find it to be a better practice with regular integrations and regular movement of changes through a version control system or a source control system. And so having it in source control means that we are tracking what's going on. We have the ability to not only understand the history of changes and where we've applied changes to add an enhancement or fix a bug. We also understand how to get back if we make a change that shouldn't happen. Now, Redgate, we have lots of tools for the developers like SQL Prompt, SQL Source Control, SQL Test, and many, many more in the Toolbelt. But ultimately, we plug into whatever types of system you want to use. So we plug into both Visual Studio and Management Studio, and then we plug into any type of version control system you want to use. And from there, we were capturing the create statement. So I always have the view in my version control system of what is the current state of my database. This helps me to easily view a database and a version control commit and decide what has changed. From there, we want to introduce continuous integration. And this is something application software has been doing for a long time. And Arnie is going to show this briefly. But here, essentially, we want to take whatever changes we've made and integrate them with all the other changes people have made, and then do some validation to determine if these changes are appropriate. So we do some automated testing at this point, some static code analysis if necessary. We can do code coverage, those kinds of things. And again, we plug into all sorts of continuous integration servers or build servers. We're really not, concerned about which one you want to use. We want to work with whatever you're using already. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we have a smooth process for releasing our software so that the way that I release to testing or QA or staging or beta is the same way I release to production. And I want to do that in a consistent, repeatable, reliable fashion with manual review or manual pauses if that's appropriate. And again, we plug into any software there. And then ultimately, we don't want you to forget about once the software is in production. We want you to monitor it and back it up and be sure you're checking for drift or changes that might be out of band. So we provide tools there, but ultimately, we want you to follow that same process. So with that, let's pop into a demo. Arnie, are you ready?
Oh, yeah. Let's do this.
So let's flip over to Arnie's machine.
Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen here.
So again, we're recording a webinar. If you've got questions, pop them in the questions panel and we'll get them answered. But otherwise, we'll let Arnie take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. So yeah, on that note, we actually have a recording of all of the previous webinars that we've also done here on the Redgate website, as you can see here. So the webinar that we're doing today is actually part of a bigger series that was broken down into 3 or 4. So the first one was more on source control. The second one was more on continuous integration and automated testing. Today we're going to be focusing on release management. But in order to do that, we actually are going to go back and go through the whole process of how to source control changes, what the automated builds and testing would look like. So that way we can then transition into release management. So the recordings will be available and are available on the our community hub website under events and friends and under webinars. So you can see all the upcoming webinars that we have lined up here, as well as the recording of the past webinars that we've done. Okay, so let's go ahead and start our demo here. So I'm going to go through the diagram that Steve just showed us in his slide. So we'll start off in development, talk about change management and best practices there as far as source controlling database changes. And then once we've made a few changes, then we'll talk about build automation and validation of our changes and making sure that everything looks good before we go out and look at release management and deployments of our changes to our target environments. So the database that I'm working with today is this AdventureWorks database here, the VSTS Git. So I'm using the full TFS stack today for the demo. So we'll be using Git in TFS for source control, and we'll also be using TFS or VSTS for both builds and releases. As you saw from the diagram, we do plug into any build and release system, any source control system. So we have customers who use, GitHub, Git in TFS, SVN, centralized source control systems, Bitbucket, and on the build and release side of things, Jenkins, Bamboo, TeamCD, TFS, Urban Code Deploy, Octopus Deploy, so you name it. So the good thing about our automation components is that they're basically a set of PowerShell commandlets that you can easily integrate into any automation platform. And we also provide plugins for some of those platforms as well, including TFS that we're going to take a look at today. So in order to start my development process, obviously the first thing I need here is a development environment to work in. Now, we all know that working with shared databases, it's a very common practice when it comes to development. Now, obviously that has some pros, but a lot of disadvantages. So obviously the main benefit of that is that if you're dealing with a large database, you don't have to spin up multiple copies of that for different developers, and that developers can easily collaborate if they don't have a good source control strategy. But if you're looking at getting a true DevOps process in place, then you have to move away from that and look into ways to have dedicated copies of databases for your developers, especially if you're looking at the source control system like Git, which is built around the idea of distributed and each developer having their own local sandbox to work with before they share their changes with everyone else. So before we continue, just wanted to point out that if you have any questions, please post them on the GoToWebinar panel here, and we'll try to get to those towards the end of the session. And if you don't get to answer all questions, then we'll follow up by email. All right, so now Redgate actually has a solution to make it a lot easier for you to easily spin up copies of databases for development and testing purposes, which is called SQL Provision. So I actually have a copy running here that I'm going to use to easily spin up a development database for myself. So here I have an image of the production version of this database that I'm going to clone from and start using this as my development database. So it's fairly straightforward to work with. So specify the server where I want the database to go to, give my database a name. I'm going to call this dev Arnie, and I'm going to go ahead and create that database. Okay, so my database is up and running. If I go back into my instance and refresh my databases, you can see that now I have a dedicated development database for myself that I can work with. The good thing about this is that even if my database is really large, the footprint of this clone database is very small, normally around in tens of megabytes to start with. So I don't have to worry about disk space or just the amount of time that it takes to go through a normal restore process. So I've got my database here. My next step is now to link this database to a source control repository, so that way I can keep track of the changes that I'm making to my development database. So this is an existing project, as you can see, and we already have a repository for this project in source control. So if I go to my TFS here, and if you take a look at our code, so here is the folder structure of our database. So our SQL Source Control plugin creates this folder structure for you when you link your database to an empty repository for the first time. So I'm just going to be working with this existing repository here. So, and because I'm using Git, I need to have a clone of this repository on my local machine. Now, to help us save time, I've actually gone ahead and created a clone, a working folder on my local machine here that I'll be working with. So I can just go ahead and link this database to that repository. So I can go here to the Setup tab of SQL Source Control, as you can see here in the middle pane. This acts as a bridge between my database and my source control system. Again, you can use any source control system. It doesn't have to be Git. It can be, centralized or Subversion or any other source control system. So so this is actually the right folder that I want to link my database to. So it's my local repository that I've cloned down from the Git repository in TFS. Okay, now the first thing I want to do is to make sure that this copy of the database that I've created from a production image actually has all the latest changes from source control. So I'm going to go to the Get Latest tab here to start with. And I'm going to see if there's anything that exists in source control that I don't have on this development database. So it looks like the only thing that I don't have is the T-SQL-T testing framework, which is an open source testing framework for creating unit tests and also doing some static code analysis. So it's a good idea for me to have these tests on my local database in case if I want to run those tests locally on my machine as well. So to do that, I'm just going to use our SQL test tool and add my database to SQL test. So I'm just going to go in here and pick my database. So this is installing the test framework and all the objects that are required by T-SQL-T. So now if I go back into source control and refresh, I should only see a bunch of SQL comp tests that now I can bring to my local database here. Okay, so you can see here, so some conflicts with some of the objects that are on my local as far as T-SQL-T. It's the system generated constraint names basically, which is fine. I'm just gonna take the one from the server and update my objects with that. And I'm also going to take everything else here that's in source control that I don't have on my database. So let's go ahead and say apply changes. Okay, perfect. So now I can actually go ahead and run these tests locally on my development database if I wanted to. So I could go into SQL test and run those. So we'll take a look at that later. But now you can see my database is linked and the database icon is green. There is nothing for me to update anymore from the master branch, which is the current branch that I'm on. So my database is now ready for me to work with and start making changes to. Now, as part of Git, as most of you know, it's very easy to do branching. So I just want to create my own branch here for the specific capability or feature that I'll be working on. So I have my own feature branch, make my changes in there, and when these changes are ready, then I'll merge those into master so we can then promote those to higher environments. So you can just go ahead and create your branch using any Git client tool that you're using or the Git command line. In this case, I have SourceTree, which is a free Git client tool offered by Atlassian. And I'll just go ahead and create my branch of our master here. And I'll just call this cool feature. All right, so we've just created my branch locally. If I go back into source control and take a look at the commit tab, you can see that the current branch now is pointing to the cool feature branch. So any changes that I make to my development database now is going to go into this branch. So let's go ahead and start making a couple of changes here and put those changes into source control. You also see it's giving me the option to create the same branch in our remote repository in the STS, which I'm totally fine with. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our database and make some changes. All right, so I'll start off by making a change to a table here. So let's say we want to add a column here to for LinkedIn username. So let's go ahead and do that. We can just use the designer. And I'm also going to make changes to a programmable object. Okay, so obviously here we have a select star, which is bad practice, and you can actually see that it's complaining about that. So it's highlighted that I have an asterisk in a select list, which is bad practice. So this is through the static code analysis rules that are available as part of our SQL prompt tool. So there's a bunch of code analysis rules that you can utilize to make sure that you're following best practices when writing your SQL, and the tool will highlight those for you using these squiggly lines here. So if I go ahead and replace this with actual column names, then that squiggly will go away. So let's replace that with some columns here. And let's also format our code, make it look good, and execute. So made a couple of schema changes or object changes. I'm also going to make a data change to one of my reference tables or my lookup tables, so which is also something that you can track through our SQL source control. So one of my lookup tables is called contact type, where we keep track of the types of contacts we have. So I'm going to add a new contact, call it a development manager. Oops, if I can type. All right, so we made some changes here. I'm going to go ahead and commit those changes into source control. Again, we're committing our changes locally first into our local Git repository, and then we'll go ahead and push those to our remote repository or our TFS server from there. So here we can see the changes that I've made. So here's the data change. So as you can see, we track data by insert scripts or insert statements. So we can see that we have a new record that we've added to this table. If I take a look at the table change, you can see we have a new column we've added that doesn't exist in source control. And we've also modified the store procedure and replaced the star with the column names. So everything looks good. I'm going to go ahead and write my check-in comment here. All right, so let's go ahead and commit this into our local repository here. So if you remember the test that we added to my database, I can actually go ahead and run those tests locally here. So if I go into SQL test, and if I go to my database here, I can actually go ahead and oops, I can go ahead and run those tests locally here on my machine that I brought back from source control into my database. So these are some more additional static code analysis tests that you can add to your database. Again, to make sure that you're following best practices, things like naming conventions, so making sure that your store procedures are not starting with SP underscore because that's bad practice, or any of these other, test that you can just easily utilize. You can also write your own unit test through the T-SQL-T framework, but here we're just relying on SQL comp for the static code analysis. We're going to be running this same test automatically as part of the build process. So if as a developer I don't run this test locally, then the build process will run those for me. And if there's any issues, will be detected by the build, and it will fail our build as a result. So let's go back to source control and make sure our changes got committed. Yeah. And as you can see here, it's giving me the option to go ahead and push those to TFS. So let's go ahead and push our changes from my local branch to the same branch in TFS. Okay, perfect. So now let's go ahead and take a look at our commits. Okay, so this is looking at the master branch. If I switch to my branch that I created, we can see that my commit and the changes are now in here under my feature branch. So we can review our changes that we made. Everything looks good. So I can now, let's say our feature is now complete and I want to go ahead and merge those into master so that way we can integrate our changes into the master branch and then move those forward to higher environments. But before I do that, I could actually go ahead and just do a build on my branch to make sure that my branch, I haven't broken anything with the state of the database that is in my branch before I even go ahead and initiate a merge into master. So I could go into my build process and here's the build that we've created for our database here. And I could just go ahead and queue a new build. Let's try again. So I'm going to queue a new build, but instead of master, I'm going to queue this build on my feature branch, just to make sure my branch can be built successfully before I go ahead and do the merge. So let's go ahead and do a build against our branch here. And what we're doing as part of the build process is creating a copy of the database schema on a temporary database to make sure that the version of the database that is in your branch is valid and that there is no, broken dependencies or any SQL Server compilation or syntax errors with your database. So if this build succeeds, then it gives me confidence that everything in my branch is valid and is working. So I can just go ahead and merge those with more confidence into the master branch. Now, generally, when it comes to merging in Git, it's a good idea to do that through a pull request. So your peers or the senior developers or someone from the team can review your changes and make sure that everything looks good before the merge happens and before the changes get promoted up the chain to the target environment. So as part of the build process now, it's validating our project that is checked out from source control. That was successful. So now it's also going to go ahead and run those tests that we just ran manually in SSMS against our build database as part of the automated process. So these are the same SQL comp tests that we just ran from SSMS. Those are going to run automatically as part of our build process. Now, let's take a quick look at our build definition here. So here you can see we have a couple of steps from SQL change automation. Now, those of you who've seen our previous webinars or our existing Redgate customers and use our tools. So we actually went ahead and renamed our automation component from DLM automation to SQL change automation. So when you go ahead and update your extensions or your plugins, you'll see that the new name is Redgate SQL Change Automation. So for those of you who are new to this and you go back and watch some of our older webinars, you'll see that we referenced DLM automation there, but that has now been renamed to SQL Change Automation. But the capability is exactly the same, so nothing has changed there as on the technical side of things. So the build, again, points it to a specific SQL Server instance to do a temporary database build. And if that succeeds, then we go ahead and package up the files into a NuGet package. And we also go ahead and run those tests that are added to source control automatically as part of the build process to make sure that everything looks good and there are no issues with your code or your SQL scripts that you have in source control. Okay, so let's go back to our builds real quick, make sure our build completed successfully. Yep, so as you can see, our build was successful, and this was triggered off of the commit that we did into our specific feature branch. So everything looks good. My build was successful. My test ran successfully, so I can just go ahead and initiate that merge into master now. So I'm going to go into my feature again. As you can see here, it's giving me the option to create a pull request. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Quickly review the files that are getting merged here. Make sure that there are no surprises or anything else that we weren't aware of. So everything looks good. Let's go ahead and create this. So obviously, if there is anyone that needs to approve it, they will get a notification as part of this process that there is a pull request to review. But in this case, since it's just myself, I'm going to go ahead and complete it without needing a review process. Okay, so our merge was complete, which means that now it's going to do another build on the master branch this time around to make sure that all of our changes are now nicely integrated into the main branch, which could also have some changes that have come from other developers or other branches that got merged as well. So now we want to make sure that our changes nicely integrate with everyone else's changes and build and validate that as well. So if you go back to our build here, you can see now there is a build in progress on the master branch off of the same merge that we just did. So it's going to go through the same validation process. So build a new temporary database off of what's in master, go through the same automated tests, make sure everything looks good. And if that passes, then we can go ahead and look at release management and create releases to deploy the artifacts from this build to our target environments. In some cases, you might want to even just push the same branch and deploy that to your test environment before you look at merging it into your main. There's different reasons for that. So some folks might have different, features or capabilities or functionalities that they're working on concurrently, but there is no specific order in which function capability or which feature should go first. So in those cases, you might want to build the branch and also deploy the branch directly to a test environment if that's the only thing you want to test in the test environment and not worry about everything other changes that have come from other features or other teams as well. But in this case, we're just basically merging into master to initiate the actual deployment process to all of our environments. So let's take a look at where our build is now. So the build was successful, as you can see. It also ran all the tests, and the tests were successful, and therefore we had a successful build. So our continuous integration process is complete. Our test passed. We could even take a look at the tests that we ran as part of the process. You can see we had a total of 36 tests. I could even take a look at, the details of those tests, and we can see exactly what tests we had, how long it took to run those tests, and if there was any failures, you obviously see those here and the details. So we also created an artifact, which is a NuGet package, as I mentioned earlier on. So if I say download the database artifact, so let's quickly take a look at that. As you can see here, it's a NuGet package. So, and if I open up this NuGet package that you could open using NuGet Explorer or any zip application, we can see that it contains the state of our database. So the same folder structure that we had source control is packaged up into this NuGet package, so we can then compare this state to our target environments as part of the deployment process, which utilizes the engine of our compare tool that most of you are familiar with already. So let's go ahead and create a release now to deploy this NuGet package to our target environments. So I'm going to create a release from within the build process. And if you take a look at our release pipeline here, we have three different environments that we are deploying to. So we have testing, staging, and production. So let's take a look at our pipeline real quick. So as you can see here, we have these three environments, and each of these environments that have their own tasks and steps that we go through for deployment. So let's go back and make sure our release got created. It doesn't look like it got created, so let's go ahead and create it again. So we're going to create the release, and we're going to start the deployment automatically to our testing environment. I could go ahead and create a release automatically upon successful builds as well to initiate the deployment to our testing environment without any manual intervention. So it's really up to you as far as how much you want to automate and where you want individuals to go in and click a button to do a deployment. Okay, so it started the process. So let's go back and take a look at our pipeline and talk about the deployment steps that we go through. So let's take a look at the testing environment, for instance. Again, as part of SQL change automation, you can see we have the release extensions here that you can utilize. So it's broken down into two steps in this case. The first one is called create database release, where it runs a comparison between the copy of the database that we have in the NuGet package and the target environment that we're deploying to, in this case testing, to generate a visual report of what differences exist in terms of schema differences, as well as data differences in lookup tables, and also generates an update script that synchronizes those differences. So once this is done, all these reports are saved off to disk, so you can have an audit trail of what was deployed as part of each individual release, as well as giving you a chance to review those before you push those out to your next environments. So once that report and the update script is generated, again using the engine of our compare tool, then it goes ahead and executes the deployment script against the target environment through the second step. Now, if I wanted, I could introduce a manual intervention step between these two. So when the update script is generated, I could send a notification to a DBA or someone to review the actual deployment before it gets applied to our target environment. So let's go back and take a look at the state of our release, see where we're at. So as you can see, the deployment to our testing was successful. So I'm going to click on release number 7, and I'm going to initiate the deployment to our staging environment here. And while we're doing that, I'll quickly show you that report that I mentioned that we create as part of the release process. So let's go back into here. So here's our release project. So we just deployed to testing, release number 7 that was. And if you look at the reports, you can see there's an HTML file which gives us a detailed overview of exactly what objects were different between our database package, which was the NuGet package, and the specific test environment that we're deploying to. So if you expand these differences, you can see we had a new column here that got added. So this is just basically showing us what's different in the object definition. This is not the actual deployment script. And how the store procedure has changed, and how we replaced this line with these lines here in the store procedure, and also the data that we added to the contact type table, which was the development manager. If there's any risks of losing data So if you're dropping columns or refactoring a column and things like that, that could result into data loss, then you will see warnings on those here. But in this case, there are no risky changes that could result into data loss, so there's no warnings. And finally, the actual deployment script that gets generated by compare. So you can see here's the alter table to add the column, here's the alter procedure, and finally the data script to insert the data. Another thing you notice is that for those of you who are not familiar with compare, you can see it's also gone ahead and refreshes those views that rely on that person table that we modified. Now this is obviously best practice, and in a lot of cases where we do things manually, we actually forget to refresh the views. So compare automatically handled that for us, so which is perfect. Okay, so everything looks good as far as our deployment script. Our deployment to our testing environment was successful. So if I go back in here and take a look at our staging, you can see the deployment to staging also succeeded. And we have a similar report that we just saw specifically for the staging environment. So we could go in and take a look at that report too, in case if there's environmental differences between testing and staging and want to see exactly what those are. And finally, I can go ahead and initiate my deployment to the production environment, going through the same process. Now with TFS, you can have, they've done a really good job of providing you ability to have pre and post deployment approval gates between environments. So if I wanted, I could go in and specify individuals to review a deployment to staging before we can initiate a deployment to production, for example. So that's something you can do and apply those approval gates as part of your automated release process. There's a question from one of our audience, John, is asking, what is the staging environment used for? So a staging environment is basically for to have a true copy of production that you can test your deployments against and pretty much test the production readiness of the changes that you're promoting before they actually go live to production. So ideally, you want your staging to match your production in terms of in terms of a schema, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of amounts of data that you have in production. So you want it to be as close match as possible to production, so for you to truly test the production readiness of your changes and the deployment that is going out to production at some point. Okay, so if we do this. Okay, so this is going to complete, and that should conclude our demo. So I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes that we have left, go over some pending questions. I can see that Steve already took care of most of those, but Steve, is there anything that you think is we should address at this point, or any questions, interesting questions that we should go over?
Yeah, so there's a few different changes. So here's a good one I thought I answered, but I'm just curious how you set up. Somebody asked, how much prep work is there to get this thing set up? So if somebody decided to engage right now, they've got a dev database and a prod database and say a test database. What do you think about the timeline of getting something like this set up?
So it depends on how much of the infrastructure you already have in place. Like if you already have a build system in place, like TFS or something else that your application team might be using, then it's fairly straightforward to get the database pipeline set up as part of that same process. So maybe a couple of hours if everything goes well. Normally, you get some hiccups when you're setting up your builds if you have invalid objects in your database, because the build will keep failing and you have to go back and clean up those objects until you build starts to succeed before you can continue to setting up your release process. So that might take a bit of time depending on what state your databases are at and how clean your databases are. If you have a lot of technical debt that you're accumulated over time, then you should anticipate a bit of time to be spent on just cleaning up the database until you get a successful build. But other than that, it should be fairly straightforward, especially using the plugins that you just saw that we offer to define your build and release process. And this is actually something that we work very closely with our clients for and help them set up their build and release process. So if it's something that you think you could benefit from and we could help you save a lot of time setting it up, then definitely reach out to us and we'd be more than happy to work with you to set that up on your end.
Yeah, I would say that it's also the technical side is pretty easy. Like if you had 3 databases and let's say you had a version control system, within a day, Arnie and I could install a build server and get you set up and moving changes. But the cultural side of understanding what's going on, trusting the changes, sticking to the process, that's hard. That's more time.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah.
So,
really good point. Yeah.
So somebody asked, there's a couple others. Somebody asked about moving data around. If I needed to avoid the identity, using identities, right? So development and production just don't try to sync their identities. What do we do there?
So if I'm assuming he's referring to or she's referring to the lookup data.
Lookup.
Is that,
yeah, static data.
Yeah. So that's actually would be a bit of a problem as far as utilizing the data comparison capability in source control, because the way that we do the data deployment and the data comparisons, even between source control and your development database, is based on the identity key value or the primary key value. So if those primary key values for the same record are different between environments, then that can cause a bit of a problem as far as either generating inaccurate DMLs to apply your data differences. So the only way that this can work successfully is if your identity keys are kind of streamlined across your environment, and the same record has the same identity key between all environments all the way to production.
Yeah. So that's something. There are ways around it. So Arnie is saying, right, if you've got the identity as a primary key, that's certainly an issue, because otherwise, how do you know what you're really doing? Ultimately, my recommendation in that place is you should pull back all your identities from production and put them in development. There's no reason for development to have its own random stuff. And if you're actually coding against identity values, you're asking for trouble. The other thing you could do is you could use idempotent scripts and deploy those through that would say, if static value equals whatever value you want to have, then don't do anything, right? If it doesn't equal that, then insert it or update it or whatever you have there. But you could get into troubles writing those scripts, because then you're assuming that I'm comparing a value that doesn't have a typo in it. So I think, John, you brought up that there's a space in development manager in the static data. How would I make that change today? Well, I'm counting on just kind of remembering and doing a lot of stuff manually as a human there, but trying to do that programmatically and assuming that it would work easily between systems could be difficult. So it's not a simple thing to do that. Ultimately, you want to sync development from production so that you're developing in a known environment and you're working forward. So we've got some more time. So somebody asked about, is there a way preventing those scripts from dropping or recreating large indexes or constraints on tables? So I know we've got SQL compare switches that we can use in there to prevent some of those things.
So so you've got we've got some SQL compare options switches that could be used to prevent that. But yeah, other than that, I can't think of any other workarounds with the state-based approach. We do have kind of as part of the SQL change automation, we do have a migrations-based approach, which is normally a better fit for shops where you do a lot of, refactoring changes, a lot of changes where a compare engine may not be able to generate the best script for it. So you could go down the path of this migrations approach. So where you have more control over the scripts that are generated, and you can modify those and customize the behavior of your deployment. But as part of the state-based, which is what we looked at through SQL source control, the SQL compare options or switches are really your main bet as far as customizing the behavior.
Yeah, I would also add you could write tests to let you know when those changes are going through, and then use filtering to exclude those out. That would be the thing that I would look at doing. But I've actually, once we go back, I'll pop over and I'll show you something I have there. Let me go. So somebody asked, can you get the database differences in a tab in VSTS? I don't think we can do that, Arnie, right? Because VSTS as a release server doesn't allow an artifact to be pushed out. Is that correct?
So they do allow that. So it requires a bit of work actually to add that as a tab. So if we go into, let me go back into the build real quick, and let's take a look at one of our recent builds, or the one that we just ran.
Wow, so they really changed the UI.
Let's see if we can database diff report here. Yeah, so as you can see, we have the actual option to show the database diff report, but we actually need to make some changes here, because this database diff report is for our migrations approach. So if you follow our migrations approach, you will see a database diff report similar to the one that you just saw that I pulled up in HTML. So we're actually in the process of also making this work for the state-based approach. So for that reason, it's not showing up here. But yeah, it's definitely possible, as you can see here.
Okay, there's a couple other questions. I know there's a few people have asked about rollbacks, but we're kind of running out of time. So let me actually just real quick flip back to me. Sure. Rollbacks are always a difficult item to talk about. So it's not that I don't want to talk about it, but it's not as simple as everybody thinks. Everybody wants to just press a button and have everything go backwards. But that's not often what you want to do. So in any case, Arnie, we need to do a webinar on rollbacks at some point.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I quickly wanted to mention here, since our topic was release management, is that it also really depends on whether or not you're doing, big bang releases, or you're really doing true DevOps and releasing smaller changes at the time. So if you're doing smaller changes, obviously rolling those back should be a lot more straightforward than if you're doing, big bang releases like monthly releases or quarterly releases and things like that. So, but yeah, I totally agree with you. That should be a separate topic to just talk about in a separate session.
Yeah, so let me flip back just real quick on redgate.uservoice.com under SQL compare. This is an item I've actually added for risk, because I've seen this a number of times, is that table changes or changes to objects are not the same. So the table changes to my list of countries table, or to my, let's say list of departments table, is vastly different than the table change to my order line item table. Right? One could be an order of a table that has a few hundred rows. One could have, tens or hundreds of millions of rows. And so there are chances where I don't want to rebuild a table or index for certain particular tables. So I've added this idea that I would really like to see a risk value included in SQL compare, which would also follow into SQL change automation, other places where we could filter on risk, or we could say that we're not going to allow certain changes, or that we want to be notified that if we're changing the 1 billion row order line table, I got to raise a flag that everybody knows this could take time when I release it. So if you're interested, please vote for this, because I think risk is a huge issue in doing DevOps deployments. So with that, let me also pop back over here real quick. We have built a maturity assessment tool in a few different areas that lets you kind of evaluate where you are in the DevOps process. And so if you'd like to take the report, you can do it online, and you can get a copy of it and kind of see how you compare against other customers and other people that have done this type of stuff. And then lastly, if you've got questions, you can contact us at Database DevOps, or see our full solution at /solutions. And get information. And certainly if you have questions on specific tools or scenarios, the Redgate Hub has a forum section where we answer questions. So with that, I want to kind of end the webinar here, Arnie. So thank you very much for doing a demo and helping us out today. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much, Steve.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So with that, we'll end the recording. Stop it here, but I'll stick around and answer a couple questions. Arnie, I don't know if you can stay around or if you have to go.
No, I'm totally fine. Yeah.
Okay. So so in the rollback thing, let me just